friends. I'm Amy Morgan, the feature writer for the Marriage Initiative, and I'm delighted to introduce Nick Stumbo to you today. Nick served as executive director of Pure Desire Ministries since 2016. He connected with Pure Desire in 2010 and found victory over his own struggle with pornography addiction through its program. Since then, he speaks at Pure Desire conferences and wrote Setting Us Free, An Unexpected Journey of Grace, followed by Safe, Creating a Culture of Grace in a Climate of Shame. He continues to encourage people on their journey to overcome sexual brokenness. Nick, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, glad to be a part of it. Thanks for having me.
Oh, well, pornography really is something that's been kept under wraps in Christian circles. Everyone seems to kind of know it's wrong, that the secrecy and shame keep people from seeking the help they need. Let's talk about that, about why, people just kind of stuff it away and don't deal with it. And so that keeps people locked in the cycle.
Yeah, it really does. When we've done conferences around the country, we will ask people, how many of you grew up in homes that talked openly about sexual things in a positive manner?
Yeah.
So openness alone, if it's negative sexuality, isn't necessarily helpful. But we're asking Christians, did you talk about sex in the home growing up, maybe other than a birds and the bees type conversation? And routinely, less than 1% of people in the room will raise their hand. And that means that the vast majority of us grew up in good Christian homes that just never talked about sex. And so I think a reality is that we weren't given a language to talk about healthy sexuality, let alone the struggles or challenges that we face. And then the vast majority of us probably as well attended churches that rarely, if ever, heard topics like sex, lust, and pornography addressed from the stage, other than to say these things are wrong, don't do them, and sex is for marriage alone. And I think most of us got that message. But then if we did have challenges and struggles, we didn't know where to go with it. And it feels very personal. It's very private. It's messy. It's awkward. It's not always an appropriate conversation, in mixed company or with kids in the room. And so I think there is a truth there that many just don't have a language for how to share this. And so fixing it on your own, trying harder to stop, getting help privately is kind of what we do. And yet, unfortunately, we find that that's the very thing that keeps us stuck in the cycle of struggle and of doing the things we don't want to do, because we're doing it alone. And as long as we do it alone, our likelihood of changing long term is very, very limited.
Yeah. Well, and you think, you and I think I'm older than you, but we kind of grew up before cell phones were a thing, before the internet was a thing, and still, it was still easy to stumble across inappropriate material. Now, there's a cell phone in everybody's hand by the time they're 12 at least, and it's just I cannot even imagine that there's probably anyone who's older than 12, probably younger than 12, who's not at least been accidentally exposed at least once. And you said that
Yeah.
sets up kind of a brain chemistry cycle, right? Because that's what happens is you may see something you didn't want to see, or maybe you did want to see it, but then it's hard to break free from that.
Yeah. The truth that we know from a lot of research is that the average age of exposure to pornography is 11 years old. So that's fifth grade, and it's getting younger because of, like you said, smartphones, tablets, gaming systems.
Yeah.
And whether intentionally or unintentionally, or at a friend's home, on a school bus, or at the playground, kids are being shown stuff and seeing things. And what is happening is God designed our brains to react in a very significant way to nudity, to sexuality, and obviously in his design was intended to be experienced exclusively with our spouse. And yet now we've really gotten everything out of order, in that many people are, for sometimes 15, 20 years, exposed to pornographic content before they're even thinking of marrying, maybe in their late 20s. And that is shaping our brain. At the moment you see sexual content, your brain is beginning to release dopamine that says, this is exciting, I want to see more, I need to know what this is. And yet at the same time, you might be feeling those feelings of shame and remorse, which are only amplified because that piece of your brain says you want to see more and more. And then if we continue to view pornography, it is actually shaping that same kind of cycle that we talk about in any kind of addiction, where you need more and more of the content or the substance in order to get that same hit that your brain once felt. And just like people talk about with drugs and alcohol, or even maybe food and gambling issues, you can find people that are essentially chasing a sexual high
Yeah.
with pornography or sexual content because of what it's doing in their brain and how much it has shaped their functioning, even at a chemical level. And you can actually see that in brain scans, that if someone has been, routinely exposed to pornography and is becoming addicted to it, it is altering the chemistry of their brain and limiting blood flow to certain sections of the brain, and making it more likely that we'll continue to go back.
Well, I'm so glad that you are able to explain that, because that really helps remove some of the shame and remove some of the guilt, because it's not just a matter of willpower. It's not just a matter of, avoiding triggers or whatever. There is a physiological things that are happening and make it so much more difficult to just say, oh, I'm not going to do it anymore. You found it extremely difficult to just try to break your cycles.
Yeah, well, and we do want to point out that willpower is important, and trying to have guardrails and boundaries do
Right.
matter. But what we find is that if that's the only attempt we make to break free, and we are doing so in isolation, we very often don't have the tools to change. And you're right, that was my story. I grew up in a good Christian home. Ironically, about the age of 11 years old, I was at a friend's house, and we had snuck downstairs late at night after they thought we were asleep, and were watching over their shoulders as they viewed some explicit sexual content that night on the TV. And my brain exploded with these thoughts and images of like, what is this? And I want to see more. And yet at the same time, this horror, guilt, and shame of, what am I seeing? This is wrong. And my mom and dad would be so upset. So I can never tell them. And I
Mm.
find that my story is common for so many people, that they would say their first exposure to something sexual was both secretive and shameful.
Yeah.
Secretive in that they didn't feel like they could tell the parents or adults in their life, and shameful in that they felt bad about it because they wanted to see more.
Yeah.
And so that honestly became my pattern through my teenage years. As I found ways that I could get pornographic magazines. And then, you mentioned our age. When I was in college is when the internet kind of became a thing, and people were using email for the first time. And you found that those same images that you had to pay for and go through the awkwardness of purchasing something at a gas station or convenience store were now available online if you had the patience to wait for the screen to load on dial-up.
Yeah.
But it for myself and so many others that get attracted to online pornography, it just takes the addiction to another level, because now there is a little sense of novelty, and our brain loves novelty. God created us that way for good reasons, but sin and Satan hijack God's purposes in our brain all the time for evil purposes. And so the novelty of being able to see anyone, anytime, anywhere, which is what kind of pornography presents, I just found that allure was something I wasn't able to stay away from, even though I was studying for full-time ministry, was very sincere in my faith, and was not. I think sometimes we feel that people who struggle with pornography must be living a double life. They've got all these secret stashes hidden. And I
Yeah.
find that the opposite is actually true, that most sincere Christians would say, no, I'm battling against it. Every time is the last time. I'm never going to go back again. And they'll have a period of sobriety, maybe a couple of days or maybe a couple of weeks or months, but without real community around them or tools to change, they keep going back. And that was very much my story through college. Got married at the end of college to a beautiful gal, and my wife and I started into full-time ministry. And ministry can be an isolating profession at times, and it doesn't feel safe for a pastor to go and say, I need help in this area. And so I continued that struggle alone. But because of my integrity, had been honest with my wife before our marriage about some of my past and my struggles. And she, of course, just being a wonderful person that she is, she said, I forgive you, and can you just promise me you'll never do it again? And I made that promise as best as I could, even saying, I'm going to try really hard, but I feel like I've promised people this before and it keeps coming back. And in our marriage, it did. Even though ministry was going well, our marriage, I would say, for all intents and purposes, was going well. I was still struggling once a month, every couple of months, with binging back on pornography. And you would just go through the whole cycle again, confess, feel horrible, make more boundaries, make more guardrails, tell God and my wife I'm never going to do it again, and then a few months later be back in it. And really that cycle continued for the first 10 years of our marriage and almost destroyed us. It really brought us to the very breaking point in our marriage.
Yeah, because and I think one thing, and we'll talk a little bit too about what Pure Desire offers for wives, but it's not about sex. Although as the wife, but although truly you also point out that 1/3 of the people that come are women struggling with the same thing.
Yeah.
It's not just all guys,
Yeah.
but it's not about sex really at all, but yet it feels like it is. And I think that's another part that feels so icky about it, right?
Yeah. I mean, it is sexual behavior. And so it's in that realm. But what we find is that it is not our need for sex that actually drives our struggles with pornography and other unwanted sexual behavior. In fact, that very mindset that suggests I quote unquote need sex is part of the problem. That for some of us, we have been taught as young men to think I have this strong sexual desire or urge that no one really knows how to handle. And so your best hope is to get married. And then we may have this myth that believes, well, marriage will fix me and make it go away. But at its root, our struggles with lust and pornography aren't about that sexual desire. It's a part of it, but what they're really about is pornography has become for so many a way to numb out on life, to medicate pain, to avoid unwanted feelings or emotions, how to deal with rejection, discouragement, discomfort in a relationship. What I like to say is early on, in our challenge in this area, we may have struggled because we had hormones and curiosity and we saw something and our brain reacted to it and was drawn to it, that initially it was about desire and appeal, but over time that also became fused with a way of dealing with life. And so when we felt down or low or rejected or bored, I find for a lot of men boredom is a huge part of it. Well, what's an instant fix to boredom? I'll tell you that the sexual high of pornography lights up all kinds of centers of the brain and the dopamine hit. And even if only for a few minutes we feel all this excitement, that reward is enough for our brain to latch onto and say, well, when I'm feeling these things,
Yeah.
I need more. And so over time, what we chose as a behavior is now choosing us. That our
Yeah.
brain has associated all of these negative feelings or experiences with now a desire to go and help myself feel better. And one of the quotes I heard early on in my recovery from our ministry's founder, Dr. Ted Roberts, he said, we were all born to be addicted to Jesus, but we've learned to become addicted to something else. And what he
Yes.
meant by that is in God's perfect order, anytime we feel discomfort, pain, shame, loneliness, isolation, by design, we should run to Christ as the source of that need. But in a fallen world, we've learned to run to other things, like I mentioned before, maybe food or gambling or substances. And pornography becomes one of those things that we're now running to that. And it creates this false solution actually for a time. Like for a few moments, it feels better, but then we're actually worse off than where we started. And that's where no amount of sexual activity in like a person's marriage, a lot of guys will say this, I'm so confused. My wife and I are sexually active quite frequently, but I still will go to pornography. What's wrong with me? And we try to help them understand, well, what's wrong with you is common to all of us, that sex in and of itself isn't the need. It's how you're dealing with life. And until you learn new ways of dealing with life, of dealing with negative experiences or pain or emotions, that's going to be the draw. And so we really help people go to a deeper place to understand the why behind their behavior. People know what they're doing and they know what they want to change, but most people don't know why. They haven't really seen what's driving this. And when you can get under the surface and begin to unpack that, it really is a game changer in terms of our recovery.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about how you connected with the Pure Desire and how that helped you.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned in our story, for the first 10 years of our marriage, I was trying desperately to be free of it. Thought a few times that I'd been successful. It'd maybe go 4 or 5 months with no acting out, and you're like, okay, finally,
Yeah.
it's in the past. I've grown up, and then it would come back, and just every time the same pattern, the shame and the remorse. And as I mentioned, at about that 10-year mark, I'd had a very honest conversation with my wife, and she had really been blunt to say, I'm tired of this. It hurts.
Yeah.
She said, I don't hate you, but I hate the way it makes me feel. And if it's not going to change, I don't know if I can stay around for this much pain. And so that, that scared me to feel like, man, if I don't change, I could lose my wife and my kids. And, with that, my job as a pastor, because usually a church doesn't pay the pastor if his wife leaves him for over pornography, like everything was on the line.
Yeah.
And so I had all these boundaries, all these guardrails. And yet just 1 month later, I relapsed again. And in that moment, I had this fear that I'm going to lose my marriage. And I confessed to my wife, and it was horribly painful. And we really did make some significant changes in terms of like getting rid of the internet. And again, just trying to build the boundaries so high that I could never act out.
Yeah.
And yet I knew that on the inside, nothing had really changed. I think there's just this mindset, if I can just keep it away, I'll be safe.
Yeah.
And yet what makes us unsafe is the desires and urges that are coming out of the heart that we haven't understood. And we didn't know any of that. And so it was a couple of months later that I was in the middle of this, white knuckling it, just trying to avoid ever acting out again, when we were at a conference for pastors in my denomination. And unbeknownst to me, they had invited in Dr. Ted Roberts to be the keynote speaker and to bring in Pure Desire Ministries as an affiliate of our denomination to help pastors who were struggling. And he preached this beautiful message. And then our leaders got up and made this astounding offer to say, if you're a pastor who struggles with pornography, and it doesn't involve, real relationships or anything illegal, we want to help you, not punish you. We want to help you get free. We want to help you stay in your job, and we want to pay for a big chunk of the process.
Wow.
And it was such a rare offer even then, 14 years ago. And I find even now, most pastors don't feel that they've been given that opportunity.
Yeah.
And so here we are in the midst of our pain. And you would think I'd have been running down the aisle singing free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, I can be free at last. Like, this is ready-made for me.
Yeah.
And yet the truth is, I was so stuck in my own denial and rationalization and minimization that I thought, I think I've got this figured out. And I had my arms crossed, and I was looking around the room at the 300 or so other pastors, and I thought, I hope the men who are really struggling are listening to this offer, because this sounds perfect for them.
This the speck in everyone else's eye, right? Instead of the.
Well, and I have found that's the nature of our struggles, that we think the person who really needs help is someone who's one step beyond wherever we are. Yeah. And I've really found that that level changes depending on our current struggle. We think, well, someone else is worse than I am. They need help. For me, it's been a good couple of months. But hearing that same exact offer sitting right next to me is my beautiful wife. And while I'm hearing all these reasons to say no, she's hearing the answer to 10 years of prayer. As she's been praying, God, would you help Nick find someone that has a pathway to freedom? She believed I was sincere in my desire to be free, but she also saw that I didn't have anyone to help me or any tools to get there. And for the first time, we're hearing, here it is. And so, I'm getting this elbow, like,
yeah,
you're going to go talk to them,
you're not going
right?
to lose your job,
Yeah, you're going to go talk to them, right? And so we entered into a process with Pure Desire Ministries shortly after that, which included her and I meeting regularly with a counselor that understood the Word of God, what it was like to be a pastor, and how the human brain works in this area. Yeah. And they really began to walk us on a journey that also included requiring both my wife and I to be in a weekly group. Yeah. Myself with other men who struggled, and my wife with other women who were experiencing betrayal. And I would say that combination of the expertise of a counselor, but maybe more essentially, actually having safe community where I could tell my whole story, where I could be known and accepted, and walk through a curriculum that really guides you to understand, like I was saying earlier, the deeper stuff that's driving the behavior. It was just like every week, these light bulb moments of, I've never seen that before. I've never made that connection. I've never understood that. And yes, it still included having healthy behaviors and boundaries and guardrails, but it was now partnered with taking the Word of God and really applying it to places in my story, to places of pain and trauma that I'd gone through, and understanding where was God in those situations, and how would I learn to trust in something other than God that had really led to my struggle with pornography. And so it was a transformational year for us. I mean, it was really an all-in kind of approach on recovery and healing. But I found, and so many have found, that's what it takes to be free. We can't make a half-hearted effort and hope to have a whole solution. Yeah. We really have to be all in on our recovery. And when we were and walked through the curriculum that Pure Desire has, it changed everything for us. It really began a transformation, not just in my behavior, but I'd say in my heart, in the way I related to my wife, and in the way our relationship worked. That we still look back at today, and we describe our marriage as before Pure Desire and after Pure Desire, because it's not just the behavior that changed, it's really the whole way we related to each other and the way that I did life. And that was exciting to see that it wasn't just pornography, it was everything connected that needed to be unraveled and set right so that God could do a work in us.
Oh, well, you are really brave to share the story. And you felt after that year then to share with your entire church. And here you are, the pastor.
Yeah.
And you were worried, and rightfully so. I would think that some people, some marriage champions are thinking, oh yeah, that probably, didn't go well, but that's not what happened. Could you share what happened when you did share with your church?
Yeah. Well, and truth be told, I did not want to share initially. I wanted to fix this. I wanted to sweep it under the rug. I wanted to be healthy. I wanted to save my marriage, but like I didn't want to be known for this. I wanted to just fix it and move on and live my life. And I remember at one of my last counseling sessions, our counselor said, "Okay, Nick, you're ready." And I said, "Great. What am I ready for?"
Ready
And he
for
said,
it?
"You are ready to tell your story to your congregation." And I said, "No, I'm not. I don't think I'm ever going to be ready for that." But we had a conversation that day that was so helpful to me, because he said, "Nick, if you look at your story, you've come from a good Christian family, you've got a supportive wife, you've had all kinds of advantages in your life, and yet you still struggle with pornography." And he said, "How many men in your church do you think might have a similar struggle who haven't had the advantages you've had? I mean, if you struggle, who else?" And he said, if you sweep this under the rug and just go about, being the happy couple and leading your church, you will miss an opportunity to open the door to healing for so many others.
Yeah.
And that made a lot of sense to me. And I still wasn't totally on board, but I believed that God was speaking through him and to us. And so at a weekend service, after preaching on Romans 7 and the Apostle Paul talking about why do I do what I don't want to do,
Yeah.
I said, I think today I can bring some unique perspective to this passage, because for over 15 years in my life, I've struggled with an addiction to pornography. And you could have heard a pin drop in that room. That was a level of transparency that I was a pretty open pastor, but that was a whole new level.
Yeah.
And I went on to ask for their forgiveness for how I had failed in this area, failed as their pastor and leader. And then I told about the journey that we'd been on and the healing that God was bringing. And then I asked for them to help us start a ministry for men and women who had that same struggle. And
Yeah.
our counselor had warned us. He had said, when you do that, that level of honesty will be too much for some people. They want the pastor on the pedestal. They might not feel that close to God, but they want to believe that someone is. And
Yeah. Yeah.
when you're that honest, they'll just walk away. And they encouraged me to be ready for that. And so I was. You kind of brace for, okay,
Yeah.
it's out there now. How are people going to respond? And to this day, if anybody ever left because of that moment, I still am unaware of it. And we weren't that large of a church, so I would have heard about it. But what did begin to happen that weekend and for many, many weekends after were people coming up to me, and often with tears in their eyes, to say thank you. Because if you can be our pastor and own this part of your story, then I know it's safe for me too.
Yeah.
I know that I'm accepted here because I've got issues too that I don't talk about. Because you come to church, and you look around the room, right? And everyone's wearing their nice clothes and they're singing and
Yeah.
they smile. And it's like, if you've got something you're battling with on the inside, it's almost like church is a little bit of social media, but in person.
Yeah.
Everybody puts their best foot forward. That's what we do.
Yeah.
And so the stuff that we're struggling with, we feel like, I don't know if I can bring it up here, because if I did, I might be rejected. And when the pastor can bring that forward and say, I've been helped, God's changing me, and we're all going to do this together, it just changed overnight. I think the dynamic of our church, where it became safe to own your issues. And we
Yes.
began starting these groups for men and women, men who struggled, women who'd been betrayed, and then eventually for women who were struggling as well. And it just, I tell people all the time, it's not an overstatement to say that it became the most significant discipleship that our church ever did. Because rather than only teaching someone principles of faith or teaching them to read their Bible or engage in spiritual disciplines, we were getting into the really deep stuff that really touches on your core identity, who you are in Christ, has been deeply impacted by the wounds from your past and the way that you're medicating it with pornography. And when people began to experience Christ there, it was changing them from the inside out. And so it really helped people mature in Christ by identifying the place in their life they were probably the most stuck in immaturity, and then creating that safe environment where people actually knew they were welcome to come forward into these groups, and in a safe, confidential way. I don't literally ask people to come forward, because when you're locked up in shame, to tell someone to come forward and admit it, like,
Yeah.
I get that there's faith tradition that do work at the altar, but I think in terms of these groups, it is really important to have a confidential way for people to join, so that when they're ready to reach out for help and text someone or email or call someone, they know who to call and say, I need this group. And so I invited men to say, I said, if you want to help me start this ministry, here's my phone number, here's my email, text or call me. And over the next couple of weeks, I had 10 men that approached me and said they wanted to help start the group.
That's
And the
amazing.
truth is, all 10 of them wanted to help because they needed the help for themselves first.
Yeah.
And they were men, if you just said, make a top 10 list of the guys in your church that struggle with pornography, maybe a couple of them were on the list, but there were definitely some guys asking for help that they would have been like the last names on my list.
Wow.
But what I found is that because I was playing a little bit of that Christian game of, I'm fine, we're good, everything's great, nothing to see here. Well, guess what? So was everybody else in the church.
Yeah.
And on the outside, things looked great, but on the inside, they were battling with a struggle they'd never been able to talk about before. And when they got into group, it transformed their lives and their marriages, and really became what our church was known for, being that safe, healing place for people that were struggling with sexual brokenness. And honestly, that became my ongoing connection to Pure Desire, and ultimately ending up working here full time, was just really because of what God did in our story and in our church.
Yeah. And you started speaking at some of the conferences. And then when it was time for the director to retire, they were like, you're our guy. And that's where you started in 2016. What would your advice be for the marriage champion who comes across, somehow finds a couple needing help, or maybe they are, like you said, somebody that everyone would think would be the last one, but they're really struggling themselves? What would you suggest?
Yeah, well, a couple things. What I do find is the younger generation tends to be more open, but sometimes less convicted. It's almost been normalized in young adult culture. Well, everybody sees porn, it's no big deal. So as a marriage champion there, you may have to bring in some understanding of what it's doing to the brain and how it really fights against our faithful commitment to a spouse, because it's training us to meet our needs, to be selfish in our sexual expression, and really to keep looking for novelty and the next new experience that no spouse, no marriage can ever fulfill.
Yeah.
And so there may need to be conversations there about the dangers and encouraging them to deal with this in their marriage. But I find that for anyone over 30, let's say that's kind of a generalization,
Yeah.
There is conviction about, this is not a behavior I want. I believe it's wrong. I want to change. And so I think if you discover that that's at play with someone you're encouraging, you're mentoring, you're coaching, it's really becoming that first safe place, becoming that grace-based person to say, thank you for sharing. I'm so proud of you for addressing this. And then really your role in helping direct them towards community. Because even if you as a mentor or a champion are on their side and are willing to coach and work with them, if you are the only person they're telling or working with, they're likely going to stay covered in this cloak of shame, because there's this fear that, well, like this marriage mentor knows me and it's kind of his job to support me, but if my friends knew,
Yeah.
or if the average person knew, I'd still be rejected and shamed. And that's where being in a group, walking through this experience, is so crucial, because we learned that we're not alone. We learned that the things that we struggle with are, as the New Testament says, are common, and God does provide a way out, but we usually can't learn or see that way out on our own. We need the support of community that's walking that road with us. And so if you're a part of the marriage initiative and you're helping a young man or a young woman, I think your encouragement, yes, to walk some of this road with them, but then to encourage them to enter into a community of change, to be in a group and work through this, is absolutely vital. Because if that's not present, all the principles in the world, read this book, listen to this podcast, those are all great tools. But all the tools in the world aren't enough if we're trying to use them alone. because I like to say the sickness and the remedy can't be the same medicine. And part of the sickness is our isolation and our secrecy in this area. And so the remedy can't be in secrecy trying to fix ourselves and get better. The remedy is coming into the light, into a safe community of God's people, and letting others really see us. Because when they really see us with the ugliness and the warts and the messiness and all, and they still accept us and they still engage with us in group, it's life changing. And so I think many of us may have that role, if this isn't our personal story, of being that voice that says, man, I've heard of this ministry, or and thankfully there's other ministries that do this as well. And I'd say, I'd strongly encourage you to join in one of those groups, and I'd love to support you and ask how it's going. But the work is done in group. The work is done in community. And so, yeah, I think that's a vital role that anyone could play.
Yeah. And you talk about the wives. And when you talked about the secrecy, you said sometimes for the wives who are the betrayed, their secrecy is even worse because their husband, it's his story, but she can't tell anybody. So he may be confessing to her, but she doesn't have any place to put it down. And that's what Pure Desire Ministries has, that safe place for her to process with the other wives and with the counselor in her group, correct?
Yeah. Yeah, that was certainly the story for my wife, because she was a kind and gracious woman. And, she didn't want to be venting about my problems to someone else. She didn't want to, tell her family and get them mad at me. She didn't want to tell my family if I hadn't told them. And she was the pastor's wife. So most of our friends are in our church. And it's like, well, I can't tell them what
Yeah.
their pastor is struggling with. And I think I was really blind to that in my years of struggle, the burden that she had to carry alone.
Yeah.
And she would describe, that day that I said I shared with our congregation, she describes that as one of her favorite days, because there was this burden lifted of, I'm not the only one who knows. And I can talk to people now.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things about our story, that day when I shared with the congregation, my goal was, hey, we're going to get the group started for men. And once that's running, then we'll talk about the women's group, a couple of months down the road. But that same weekend, my wife had like half a dozen ladies come up to her and say, what about us? I know my husband struggles. I don't know how to talk about it. I need help. And so she ended up starting a group that same week too, because the women were hurting and needed a place to be known and seen and say, am I crazy? Is it me? What am I doing wrong?
Yeah.
And have other women say, no, it's not you. And you're wonderful. And here's what you can do. And here's all the things you can't do. It's not your job to fix him, but it is your job to find safety and to get into a place where you are stable enough to think through, can I rebuild this relationship? And what does it look like to rebuild trust when it maybe has been so severely undermined for so long? And so that's why from really their early days, Pure Desire Ministries said, we're here for the whole family. This is, in fact, we describe sexual addiction as a family systems problem.
Yeah.
That if you have an addict, you have a spouse of an addict.
Yeah.
And if you don't like the word addiction, call it a struggler. If you have a struggler, you have a spouse of a struggler, and you have kids growing up in the home of a struggler, and it's impacting everybody.
Yeah.
And if all you do is help the person who has an addiction or who struggles, but ignore the trauma and pain and woundedness that may have created in the family, it's unlikely that the struggler can heal alone. You really have to help that couple walk towards healing. Our founder's wife, Diane Roberts, uses the illustration. So she'll say, if you only help men who struggle, it's like someone calling for an ambulance because they've witnessed an accident, and the ambulance comes and it picks up the person who made the phone call, leaving the person in the accident, bleeding out in the middle of the street.
Yeah.
And that's, kind of a graphic illustration, but I think you get the point that the person asking for help on the phone is the struggler, and great, we'll help them. But who's the wounded person?
Yeah.
Who's experiencing the pain of it? It's the spouse. They need care. And sometimes they need more significant triage in that moment to stabilize them, to help them find safety, to understand what's up and what's down. Because when we discover that our spouse has been using pornography, or obviously there are worse things that are done with, affairs and things outside the marriage, it disrupts a person. And this happens to women and men, but statistically more frequently to women who are the betrayed spouse. It disrupts everything they know about their life, about themselves, about their relationship, and they can have a very difficult time knowing how to move forward. And that's why a group is essential, because it kind of gives them a grounding point to know who I am, what do I need in this season, learning to find my voice. That was a huge part for my wife, learning how to express her needs, where she needed to stand up for herself and ask for me to address something versus just being, we almost can present this image for Christian women of just this compliant wife is ideal. And really, I don't think that's biblical. I don't think that's a scriptural approach to marriage, is someone that's just, oh, yes, honey, whatever you want, like that. And that was a little bit of her trauma story for her growing up. Like, she was expected to be the compliant child, and she had a kind, generous nature, so she often was. And I didn't have ill intent to, but it made it easy for me to take advantage of her compliance, of doing what I wanted in marriage. We traveled where I wanted, we bought what I wanted, and not because I didn't have this ill intent to manipulate, but my wife was compliant and I had ideas and I was the man. And so for her to learn her voice of
Yeah.
like, no, it's totally okay for me to state my opinion and to stand up for myself and to say what I need and to believe that my husband loves me enough that he'll want to meet those needs. It was game changing for us, but that would have never happened if she hadn't entered into a group that helped with other women, that helped her see herself and understand what was going on in her thinking, that had kind of made her, like what we realized in my wife's story, she was essentially what we would call trauma bonded. That
Yes.
my admissions of pornography was traumatic to her, but her learned response to trauma was to bond, to try to create safety and connection, even in a dysfunctional way. So like when that was exposed and she saw how unhealthy it was, she's like, I can't keep doing that pattern for me either. And that became part of what changed our marriage, not just my behavior, but her learning a new way to relate to me. And so there's just so much good that can come. And I'm kind of explaining this maybe more than necessary, because for some spouses, when they hear about this, they feel like, well, this is his problem and
Yeah.
he needs to go deal with it. I don't want to touch it. Well, you don't need group because you have a problem, but you do need group because he's had a problem and it's impacted you.
Yeah.
It has probably created collateral damage that you're only beginning to understand in terms of how you think, act, and behave. And when you find safety and when you begin to understand what it's doing to you, it's not only going to strengthen you as a person, it can strengthen your marriage as well. And so that's why the two groups, both for the one who struggles and for the one who's been betrayed, are really, really crucial.
Oh, well, that is just so, I think you explained it beautifully and you offered a lot of hope in a dark place. So thank you so much for being willing to tell your story and to be transparent, to encourage others. We're so grateful that you came to join us today.
Yeah. Well, it's not an easy topic to talk about, but statistics would say a majority of Christians are struggling with pornography at some level. And so you are not alone. And if you are the spouse of someone who struggles, you are definitely not alone. And when we realize that and find safe places to seek help, there is a ton of hope. There's tremendous hope. And I think that's where people need to start, is knowing I'm not alone and hope is out there.
Oh, well, that is just so great. Oh, we're just so glad that you were here for us. And as always, Marriage Champions, if you'd like to find out more about Nick Stumbo or Pure Desire Ministries, you can find us at marriageinitiative.org.